The Palestinians are the strongest people I've ever met in my entire life. They've been fighting for 75 years. They're going to fight for as long as it takes. Just like every occupation, it comes to an end. When you say, like, what's the end outcome? I don't see the end outcome as being great for Israel. At the end of the day, there will be a Palestine.
Welcome to Fight Back Radio, a production of fightbacknews.org, taking you to the heart of the people's struggle. I'm your host, Richard Berg, and I want to start out this episode by wishing everyone a happy International Women's Day. We're going to be releasing this episode in early March of 2024, and the International Women's Day is March 8th every year. And it's been going on for over 100 years. It started out with the textile workers in New York City, and especially the socialists in that movement, but it became an international event. And so in your city, there's likely a march or some kind of program celebrating International Women's Day. If there's not, you should hold one yourself and uphold the women in our struggle who are the backbone and have played such important roles in every community, every city, every country. And so we encourage you to do that. I want to also dedicate this episode, this International Women's Day episode, to 5 women who are on the bargaining team and the leaders of the struggle at Instituto del Progreso Latino. And there was a 5-day strike there of teachers and educators to try to put money back into the classroom. This is a charter school where public money was being sifted into other parts of their organization. It's 2 high schools, and these women and men that work there went on strike for 5 days and fought hard to get the resources put back into the school. And so I want to read off their names here. Gabriela Solis, Leah Joanitis, Evelyn Bodigan, Karina Gutierrez, and Rosie Markopoulos. And those 5 women were the bargaining team and the heart and soul. And you know what? I'm going to add one more. Marie O'Donnell was the leader of the contract action team. And so this was a woman-led strike that fought for mostly Latino students and to get resources, get more staff put into the building and the resources they need to provide a proper education. So happy International Women's Day, women. And congratulations on this huge victory, because the strike ended with a huge victory. And it's something that we're all very proud of. Our guest today, though, is Meredith Aby, who's, full disclosure, I've known Meredith for quite a while, I guess a couple decades probably. And she's been an activist for that entire time in the anti-imperialist, anti-war movement, and has seen a lot and done a lot. She was a founding member of the Minnesota Anti-War Committee, and especially, I think I could say a lot of things that she's done over the years, because she's been a nonstop activist and leader up in Minnesota and even nationally and regionally for many, many, many years. But after the Republican convention in 2008, where they nominated John McCain, she and 22 others, they called them the Anti-War 23, had their houses raided, they were indicted, and they were tried. They criminalized their anti-war activism in the war in Iraq at that time, and there was a nationwide and international movement that developed around that, and Meredith and everybody stood together. They stood in solidarity, and the police and the FBI especially, they had a grand jury, tried to get them to tell lies about each other. And these are people who were just good-hearted, conscientious people that were standing up and trying to challenge U.S. foreign policy, and they were criminalized for that. So Meredith continues. It hasn't lost a beat as far as I can tell, and continues to this day to fight. And you'll hear her talk about what's going on in Palestine as well as the Ukraine and other places, and give a full analysis of U.S. foreign policy and a critique that's well deserved of U.S. imperialism. So, here's Meredith Aby. So, Meredith, welcome to Fight Back Radio.
Thank you very much. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you. And I want to start out by talking about Palestine. And actually, I do want to spend a little time on this, but we've been the resistance and the war and the genocide, I should say, of the Israelis, the Zionists, against the Palestinian people has been going on since early October, and now they've pushed the people to the edge of the border with Egypt, and they continue to just kill people. They continue the genocide. How does this end? I mean, what's the goal of the Zionists or the maybe I'll ask you about the resistance too, but let's start out. What are they trying to do here? What's their plan? I mean, it seems other than being a horrific, cruel, and deadly actions, it's hard to see what their motivations are.
So I had the opportunity to go to Rafah, which is on the Egypt border, which is where most of the Palestinian population in Gaza has been pushed to. I had the ability to go there in 2002. And when I was there in 2002, I saw huge lines of people who were waiting to try to go to Egypt for important medical care, who were being denied day after day, who were waiting out in the sun. And in many ways, what we're seeing is just like a more extreme version of what I saw in 2002, which is that the goal of Israel is that they want people to leave. If they're Palestinian, and that could be by death, that could be by them immigrating and leaving and going somewhere else, becoming refugees somewhere else. But at the end of the day, I mean, that's really why these extreme forms of collective punishment have been used, is because they want that land and they don't want to share it. And so I think it's important to sort of recognize that, that the goal has been the same for 75 years. It's been, Israel wants complete control of that land and they don't want to share it. They see from the river to the sea in a different way than when we talk about from the river to the sea. When we talk about from the river to the sea, we're talking about the fact that Palestinians deserve to have political rights and equality and all of their historic homeland. But really what the Israeli government is looking for is from the river to the sea, is it's all Israel in charge all the time. And Gaza is particularly gone after and has been in this stage of siege and then constant bombardment and sort of like these different, periods of bombardment that have happened to really punish Gaza for daring to resist the Israeli occupation. And so I really think that that's their end goal is that they want Gaza for themselves. It's a beautiful place. I mean, we're talking about beautiful, real estate with beautiful ocean views, which I'm sure lots of Israelis from Tel Aviv would love to turn into little condos. But the fact of the matter is that there are millions of people who live there, who have the right to continue to live there and are not willing to leave. And they've interviewed people, even on mainstream news sources like National Public Radio, where Palestinians have told reporters, I don't want to leave to go to Egypt because I don't have any belief that I would ever be allowed to come back. People know that because of the way Israel has treated Palestinians for the past 75 years, is that their goal is to depopulate the area of Palestinians using any means necessary. And so people are resisting using any means necessary. And for some families, that means refusing to leave, even though it endangers their life.
Wow. So, yeah, okay. So the thing, obviously the Israelis were, for decades and decades, they lived in they set up an apartheid state, an occupation where the rights of Palestinians were not respected, or were second-class citizens in every respect. And but you're asserting that that's not good enough for them, that they actually want to get rid of all of Palestinians and create some sort of a theocracy that they can control. Am I right?
Yeah, and it's not just in Gaza that's true. I mean, if you look at the West Bank in terms of like the home demolitions, the way that they've used all sorts of methods that are frequently not even legal by their own Supreme Court to push people out of their houses, the way that they've used the wall to encircle different rural Palestinian villages. No, they definitely have that government Israeli plan is that they don't want to share this territory with Palestinians. That is totally true. And so, like, their use of collective punishment is in an effort to try to increase the amount of Palestinians that are in the diaspora, to basically make people feel like they should leave. Or, again, if they don't leave, they feel completely fine with using the IDF as being able to commit mass murder, as we're seeing right now, but also that repeatedly they just use mass incarceration. They arrest people very rampantly, and so the idea is that to make life so unlivable there, to make it so that people choose to leave, or their tactics that they use make it so that then people, are dead. And unfortunately, like you're seeing right now, there are several reports that have come out recently that one of the reasons why Israel is using the amount of starvation that they're using in Gaza is because, again, they're trying to prevent another generation of Palestinians to be able to continue to resist them. That's their end outcome. But sorry for them, I'm being facetious, but what's true is that the Palestinians are the strongest people I've ever met in my entire life. They've been fighting for 75 years. They're going to fight for as long as it takes. Like, they're not interested in backing down, because at the end of the day, just like every occupation, it comes to an end. Every colonial rule eventually comes to an end. It doesn't matter if you're talking about Vietnam, if you're talking about what's going on in Palestine, if you're talking about Iraq or Afghanistan. The fact is that the people whose homes it is, they will stay to the very bitter end to fight for their homes. And so when you say, like, what's the end outcome, I don't see the end outcome as being great for Israel. At the end of the day, there will be a Palestine. What that Palestine looks like is, it is the future that's still in motion. But whether or not there is a Palestine isn't a debatable issue, because the fact is that the Palestinian people are incredibly committed to that being a reality. But also, they're right. They do deserve to have control of their historic homeland. They do deserve to have the right to self-determination. And if anything, right now, the number of people internationally that are seeing this as a righteous cause, as being something that people should embrace and join up with, like, those are the biggest numbers I've ever seen in my 20 plus years of organizing on this issue. Like, people definitely are interested in standing in the streets and standing in solidarity with the Palestinian people. And so, Israel has done the opposite of a good PR campaign for themselves. They've really, and the international community has seen an active genocide happening. And I don't see how they're going to be able to get away with this and end up being able to sort of turn back and be like, okay, let's go back to apartheid the way it was, because apartheid the way it was already criminal. But apartheid, after you, for example, have committed mass murder and mass starvation, looks even worse. And so I don't see how Israel is going to be able to walk this back. I think that they are in the process of delegitimizing themselves on a daily basis.
Okay, so I want to get to the resistance in a minute, but let me ask you about the United States. So you did a good job. You just explained, whatever maybe it's not rational or humane, but the motives behind the Israelis. But why is the United States? I mean, they're the only one that's voting in the United Nations and et cetera, et cetera. You can say. Some of the European countries are waffling, most of them are waffling, especially the imperialist ones. But the United States is clearly, much more so than any other country in the world. I mean, the United States government, not the people.
Right. The
Much more
Palestinians are
so
very good at differentiating between our government and us as people. I saw that firsthand in 2002. People would say, your government is doing this to us, but nobody ever said, you're doing this to us.
Yeah, that's important. Yes, but Joe Biden, the president of the United States, I mean, he's pretty unabashedly been a supporter of Israel from the start. What's the motivation for him or for the leaders of the United States government to be so pro-Israel?
So I think it's important to understand that the US's plans for imperialism require that the US has a military base in Israel. Like the US uses Israel as the 51st state. It uses it as the place by which they threaten the entire region. Like the US can't exert pressure on Saudi Arabia, on Egypt, on Iraq, on Iran, on Syria, on Lebanon, and on all the other places in the Middle East without having Israel as the place that it's got lock, step, and barrel with it. And so I think that's important for us to understand that the US sees a strategic benefit to Israel. And that's a matter of fact, the reason why this is not a Democrat issue or Republican issue. This is an issue of imperialism. And both parties have historically agreed on this because both parties are imperialists and both of them want to see the US be able to thrive at the expense of other countries, internationally. And so I think it's important to understand that Israel is responsible for the U.S. is responsible for Israel's crimes. Okay, Israel came into existence with the assistance of the U.S. and the Great Britain. The occupation of Palestine has been sponsored by every single president in Washington, D.C. since the Nakba. And I think it's really important to understand that Biden himself, as well as our American, not our government because it doesn't represent us, but the American government is complicit in this genocide. They've sent more military aid to Israel. If you look over the time span since World War II, the U.S. has sent more aid to Israel than any other country in the world. So we've literally built up this apartheid state. Biden has carried so much water for Israel. He has defended Israel internationally, and he's defended their right to commit war crimes. He calls it self-defense, but this is not self-defense. These are war crimes. He's dispatched the U.S. Navy. He's ordered attacks on Yemen, which have done a valiant effort of defending and standing with their Palestinian siblings. He's ordered the bombing of Iran and of Iraq and Syria, and he's threatened Iran. And so this is not only a regional war at this point, but it is definitely being orchestrated by the United States with Israel. But the United States is in the driver's seat on this conflict, and I think that's important to understand. It is not just that Israel is doing this and they're mean, and the U.S. is letting them do this, because that sometimes is how it's talked about by different people in the anti-war movement. I think it's really important to look at the fact that this is a part of the U.S.'s imperialist agenda, and Israel serves that master. It is not, for example, that the U.S. serves the master of Israel, okay? Israel is serving the U.S.'s goals for the region and for the world, and I think that geopolitical importance is important.
So, okay, so the Israelis, okay, what you've talked about is a military control or a military domination of the region so that people can't do things, that they can't exercise amounts of independence. Mm-hmm. But imperialism, as I understand it, is about money, it's about resources, it's about wealth, and the
U.S. can't control, for example, the oil in the region without Israel. Or if you look at the conflict with Yemen, the U.S. can't control, most of the world's trade is going through that region, right? Whether or not you're talking about the Suez Canal or you're talking about, the strait next to Iran or the strait next to Yemen, that is an incredibly geostrategic place for trade, for oil, et cetera. And so the military is used as the vehicle by which to control that area for economic purposes. But you're right. It's not just controlling for military sake. It's definitely using the military to control this larger economic agenda of the United States, which goes hand in hand with the U.S.'s imperialism.
And in the case of Israel and whatever, the Red Sea, it's trade routes, it's the flow of oil, and of course, oil, as an energy source, is critical for production of anything by competitors or by friends, depending along those lines. Is that right? Am I on the right track here?
Yes.
Okay. So, now let me circle back a little bit to the resistance, and because you started to talk about that, and I wanted to talk about this first, I guess, but yeah. So, the Palestinian resistance, You said, okay, we can't go back to an apartheid state. You hear not around the world, but in the United States, especially, you hear politicians talk about a two-state solution, and that we'll have some of this and some of that. And you mentioned what's going on now. The resistance, not just in Palestine, but their allies around the world and in the region. What's the end game though for the resistance? I mean, we've had some people on Fight Back Radio who have a number of people that talked about Palestine, and they talked about a united resistance, much more so than had been in previous years, and that. But what's their goal? What's their aim? And especially at this point where it looks like at least from a military or human point of view, what's happening there is devastating.
What's happening there is devastating, but I think it's important to understand that they can't go back to the way it was. Like if you look, Gaza has been destroyed. I mean, so it's about the Israelis pulling out, but it's also about the fact that there needs to be a way for Palestinians to be able to move forward. And so they're fighting for a lot more than just like they want the Israelis out. They're fighting for a lot more than they just want, for example, an end of bombing. Like this is part of a longer term goal of being able to fight for liberation. I think that what's become apparent to the international community is that when Israel says things like there should be two states, or which they won't even agree to for the first thing, but Biden definitely has said things like there should be two states. I think that people are starting to understand, like, how can that be true? Like, how could that be possible if, for example, one country next to the other country gets to strangle them for resources and things like that? So really, I think there's becoming increasing sympathy and solidarity with the Palestinian people to sort of have this turning point where, for example, what you saw in the war in what was going on in South Africa, where this idea of like one person, one vote, everybody having political power, not having one group of people being able to surround and strangle this other group of people. Like, I think that we're seeing a transition where people are starting to think across the board at how could there be two states if, for example, Israel is carving up the West Bank, if Israel is surrounding Gaza and refusing air, like food into this area. I think people are starting to realize that like having two states is not actually liberation, and then that's not acknowledging the role that, for example, what happens to Palestinians within the 48 territories either. And so I think that people are starting to really open up their eyes to the fact that this call for from the river to the sea really does mean that people want actual liberation for Palestinian people and all of historic Palestine, as opposed to just less bombing or less starving or less murder of Palestinians in these small little enclaves that the Israelis have carved out for them.
So what does that mean? What does that look like? I mean, when we talk about Palestinian resistance, I mean the news media in the United States and the Israelis, probably the news media just reprinting whatever State Department press releases, but they talked about from the resist. It's like a war between Palestinians and Israel, and that there's that it's like a war between two states or something like that, and that it's not like an oppressed people within an area, and how does this end? What is the way, as I guess what I started to say, CNN or whatever people will say is they take our slogan from the river to the sea to mean that there should be like a mass murder of Jewish people in Palestine or something like that. What does it mean? What does liberation look like, and what is the goals of the resistance?
Well, first of all, I think it's really important to push back anytime you hear that sort of like claim that from the river to the sea means mass murder of Jewish people. Because first of all, I have seen firsthand, both in the Palestinian community here in this country, as well as when I was in Palestine in 2002, people were always able to be very clear about the difference between being being anti-Jewish as well as versus being anti-Zionist. And all of the Arab and Muslim people that I met with were very clear that they were anti-Zionist. They were not anti-Jewish, and I think that's important to delineate. The United States and the news media, particularly the Biden administration, really like to blend these two things together and make it seem like these are one and the same. And I think it's really important to understand that Biden is a Zionist, but he's not Jewish. Like, being Jewish does not have to mean that you're a Zionist and vice versa. And so I've never heard on the ground anyone say that in Palestine or in the United States who's Palestinian say that there's a future for this land that involves pushing out anyone. All I've heard is that people are asking for the ability to have democratic rights and political rights in their historic homeland. And I think that that's important. And I feel like that same type of excuse was also given, if you look at what was going on in South Africa, that people said, oh, well, we can't give the blacks vote because if the blacks got to vote, what would happen to us? It's like, so this idea that like, we can't give political power to this group of people that we have oppressed, because there might be some consequences to us for our oppression. I just don't think that argument holds water. But also, I think it's important that, to say to you, Richard, like, I'm not Palestinian. So like, I don't feel like, in the United States, my job is to say like what, liberation for Palestinians should look like. I can say what I think U.S. solidarity should look like. I do feel like that I have a really big role in being able to articulate, but I don't feel like that's as much my role to be able to say what liberation for Palestine looks like. I take my lead from the Palestinian people, both here in this country and in Palestine, but I don't feel like I have the right to dictate the terms of their liberation. But I do know that I have heard very repeatedly that my country plays an incredible role in terms of being a barrier to their liberation. Because if it was just a battle between Palestine and Israel, I think that this would be over. I think really one of the main obstacles to there being an actual movement forward is the role that the U.S. plays in terms of backing one side at the expense of the other side. And so I think an important role we have as solidarity in the United States is to end the gravy train, if you will, to end the endless amounts of aid that the U.S. gives Israel, so that, for example, they don't have to have any decision making about like, oh, we could pay for this or war. Like, they never have to make that choice because they always get to do both, because we're always the ones paying for the war. And so I think that it would be really critical if we could cut off that gravy train, or if we could slow down that gravy train, or we could at least identify that this gravy train exists, which I think more and more people are starting to realize. Whereas before this, I don't think that your average American knew the degree to which the United States was bankrolling Israel's policy against the Palestinians. But I do think that more and more people do now.
So, well, let me ask you about this. And but you talked about, you do have ideas, and you've just expressed a number of them about how the U.S. should resist what's going on there. And you're a leader of the Anti-War Committee in Minnesota, in the Twin Cities, and you've been doing this kind of stuff for but I forgot you said 20 years or something like that. So you started when you were 3, I guess. But but yes. But no. But so if you could dig into that a little bit more. What is the Minnesota Anti-War Committee doing on the ground? And I know Fight Back News has reported on a lot of this, and I encourage our listeners to go to fightbacknews.org and read about your work in the Anti-War Committee and others around the country that are resisting this. But what kind of activities have you taken, and what's your hope? What do you hope to accomplish from those activities?
I really appreciate you asking. One of the reasons why my voice sounds so scratchy is from a lot of chanting and yelling this week. So the State Board of Investment in Minnesota invests pensions of public workers, like teachers, like myself. And the State Board of Investment has 4 decision makers: the governor, the attorney general, the state auditor, and the secretary of state. And these 4 decision makers get to decide how to run the Board of Investment. And the State Board of Investment has invested about $3 billion, it's at a B, in Israeli companies and weapons manufacturers that are directly involved in the conflict. like Lockheed Martin, like Elbit Systems, like General Dynamics, et cetera. And so what we've been doing for the past several years is building this campaign to educate people where their taxpayer dollars are going, to educate people where their pensions are going, and to ask for the State Board of Investment to divest Minnesota from Israel and other businesses that are supporting Israeli apartheid. And so the State Board of Investment meets quarterly. And so they were scheduled to meet yesterday. And so leading up to that, on Wednesday, we had leading up to that last week on Saturday, we had a protest of about 1,000 people in front of the governor's mansion. Then on Wednesday, we had a protest of about 100 people in front of the governor's mansion. Well, 14 people got arrested on his front lawn. And what was great about that is that we got a lot of news coverage talking about the role that the State Board of Investment plays in terms of supporting Israeli apartheid and this genocidal campaign against the Palestinians. And I don't think that divestment is sexy. I think that it's like sort of abstract for people to understand. But I do feel like we've made some real headway in terms of people realizing that, like, oh my God, like I'm actually like paying for this. And so I feel like that was huge. And then we organized again for people to go and give testimony. And I think we had somewhere around 14-ish people who gave testimony to the State Board of Investment. And again, the number one issue that people were bringing forward in that testimony was, we want you to divest from Israel. We want you to not be investing in weapons manufacturers that are actually committing this genocide against the Palestinian people. And so I feel like that has been a really tangible way that we've been able to connect people to, like, look, this is something that the government's doing. This is a way that we have to sort of break that chain. Another campaign that we did in the Anti-War Committee was that we worked with several members of our Minneapolis City Council to get Sorry Chicago, the most progressive language passed in the entire country. Because our ceasefire resolution says an end to U.S. aid to Israel, which I think was really helpful, because a lot of ceasefire resolutions around the country have said, oh my God, there's this genocidal war, but haven't sort of drawn the lines of connections of like, yes, and we've actually helped facilitate this. Yes, we've actually paid for this. And our resolution did that. And I feel like that, again, all those battles on the letters to the editor page, the battles at the city council meeting, the arguments that the city council members had with each other, the protests that we did in front of city council, like all gave us a vehicle by which to really hammer home this idea that we are paying for this. The United States plays a leading role in terms of organizing and orchestrating this war, which I think people are really horrified by. Like, you turn on the news, you look at social media, and you're like, oh my God, they're pulling children out of rubble. They're pulling children who look like they've been starved to death out of rubble. Like, that's something that's really hard for people to be able to look at. And then to hear that they actually played a role in contributing to that, that makes people feel awful. And so then people are like, why wouldn't you want to divest? Why wouldn't you want to end U.S. aid to Israel? And so those have been some of the campaigns we've been doing to really sort of draw people's connection to the fact, not just that this is going on, because you'd have to be living under a rock to not know that, like, for example, this is going on, but it is hard to sort of have an understanding of the role that we play as Americans, because that is not a role that the US media plays very often for us. And so that's our job as the movement, or as alternative media like Fight Back Radio, to try to sort of push that envelope so that people can see that there is a relationship between the US's imperialist agenda for the region and why they're paying for and directing this genocidal campaign against the Palestinians.
No, that's good. That's good. It's impressive too. I mean, I just wanted to note, I was thinking while you were talking about, because I remember from decades ago when the fight against apartheid in South Africa was going on, this idea of divestiture was an important tactic in terms of trying to let people know, and a way for people to say, look, I don't want my money to go there. So it's something, and as we talked earlier, imperialism isn't just about a military domination of the world. It's a military domination to bring wealth to those that already have it, I guess, to the 1%. And so it's important to do things like that. We had this tour a while back where Nelson Mandela's grandson, I know, was in the Twin Cities, was in Chicago as well. I noticed you gave a swipe at my city for. Did
Hey,
you?
hey, there's a lot of love to go around. You happen to be the third largest city in America, and so therefore the largest city has passed a ceasefire. That doesn't mean that I can't, be excited about our own victories.
Yeah, and you should be. Congratulations to you for having such a solid resolution passed, and so we're on the same team. I just that's funny, but I want to talk a little bit because South Africa also brought Israel, to the International Court of Justice and charged them with genocide. And I wonder, could you talk a little bit about that? And I mean, to me, it seemed like that had a huge impact, on certain sectors, anyways. I mean, a lot of people were already seeing what was going on, but I think it further isolates the United States. Israel, I think, was probably already pretty isolated at that time. But it charges them with genocide too, and so there's a thing of in a international legal kind of way. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Well, what I thought was interesting is that so the ICJ stuff was happening around the same time that we were trying to pressure for the ceasefire resolution in Minneapolis. And so and they had been arguing about like what type of language to be able to use, right? In a city council language, you have to use like these like legally binding terms and blah, blah, blah. But what was interesting is because of the efforts of the ICJ, they were able to use things like genocide in the resolution. And I do think it put a real it gave real legitimacy to the ceasefire battles that people were having at city councils across the country. I think it gave people the ability to be like, look, this is not that we're just like sort of like hyping up the vocab here. Like, no, Amnesty International has declared this apartheid. The ICJ has declared this genocide. To being able to sort of give legitimacy to these criticisms that we've been saying for years, but like being able to be like, no, this is not just a matter of opinion. These are facts, right? These are facts. And so I think that has been really important to be able to sort of keep the momentum of this movement going. I also know so many Palestinians that felt so seen while that was happening. Like they were waking up extra early so they could go watch these proceedings online. And they were like, oh my God, people care, and I think that also put wind in people's sails and sort of gave them more energy to keep fighting, to keep chanting, to keep drumming, to keep protesting. And I think that's really huge and that's really important. But I do think that, it's important that there are sort of like a lot of different parts to the fight. I'm not saying that the ICJ stuff was more important than, for example, the stuff that's in the streets, but I do feel like, we can really sort of go after, Israel and the United States on all these different fronts, and that can have an impact because we're all working together, but sort of using our different skill sets.
Yeah, so no, that's good. Thank you for that. I want to pivot a little bit here now. I know you're a founding member of the Minnesota Anti-War Committee, and you've been doing this a long time. And so I want to take advantage of some of your knowledge on other areas as well. I want to pivot to talk a little bit about the war between Russia and the Ukraine. And again, here the press and the United States government was, all in for support. In fact, arming the Ukrainians. I assume this would have been a relatively quick war otherwise, if they hadn't been so heavily armed by NATO and especially the United States. So, I mean, could you talk a little bit about what this war was about and what is it about? I mean, I shouldn't say was because it continues to go on. And, it's because of what's going on in Palestine, it's not quite as much in the headlines as it was, but there's a bill coming up, an aid bill that's going to, that the Democrats and Republicans are arguing over to give aid to Ukraine, Israel, and to Taiwan. And so could you talk a little bit about the battle in Ukraine and how what's that really about? And is it, it's been portrayed as, look, Russia invaded the Ukraine, these poor Ukrainian people. And I know, your committee has taken a more nuanced and more complex view of this. And so I was hoping you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so it's been interesting because we, of course, didn't have nearly these types of numbers for our Ukraine-Russia war protests that we have right now for the Palestine ones. Um, in terms of like addressing this issue of like sort of what is the cause for this, um, we're a part of the Minnesota Peace Action Coalition and MPAC. We were doing protests even before, for example, this war officially started over the fact that NATO was doing so many provocative things to Russia. And so, yes, Russia did invade Ukraine, but also, like the United States and NATO have done a lot of things to sort of fan that. And so, I think if that's what you mean by the nuanced approach, I think it's important to understand that there is a rivalry going on here between the United States and Russia. And the United States and many people in the United States love to point out the weaknesses of other people's governments and don't like to look in a mirror. And so, like right away, there are all these, people who are just like, oh my God, we have to stand with the refugees. Oh my God, we have to stand with Ukraine. This is a liberation movement, da 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 da. And I think it's important to understand that, first of all, it's not a liberation movement if you want to work hand in glove with the United States. It's not a liberation movement. Like if you want to be armed by the United States, if you want special forces training from the United States, that does not make for it a liberation movement. That's like antithetical, because what happens is that the United States goes in and decides who your leader gets to be, what your strategy is going to be, how many resources they're going to take. And so I think that's important for people to sort of have that mythology debunked. The second thing is that I think it's important to sort of look at, well, why is the U.S. involved in this? Like the U.S. doesn't get involved all the time. The U.S. only gets involved if it has to do with resources, as you talked about before. Like what's the underlying current for military policy is it always has to be economics. And the U.S. does not like the fact that Russia is threatening it on this sort of like international level. And that's what it's really about, is being able to sort of take, is that they don't want Russia to be able to be a power in Europe. They want to be the only power who's having influence over Europe. So really, this is a turf war between these two countries. And then lastly, I think it's important to look at the fact, which is that, the amount of money that we've sent Ukraine, like at the same time that Biden was doing that, he was saying like there wasn't any money for, student debt relief in this country. Like one of the main slogans we have in the anti-war movement here in Minneapolis is money for human needs, not for war. And the U.S. repeatedly is like, you bet, let's go fund this war. Let's go kill some people. And then, oh, no, we don't have time or money to pay for your problems. And so, in terms of trying to make connections between like, look, this war is like directly leading to our own problems in our own country, because that's what we're focused on, is killing people in other countries. We had a lot of people who came at us in the Anti-War Committee who are like, you don't care about Ukraine, you don't care about Ukrainian deaths. And I think it's important to understand that like the United States is using the Ukrainian people as like chess pieces in this war against Russia. So I think it's important to understand that I am concerned about the amount of Ukrainian people who've died. I'm concerned about the amount of ecological damage that's happened in Ukraine with this war. I'm concerned about whether or not Ukraine will get to make their own decisions for themselves. But I don't think that, for example, the U.S. being involved in this conflict is going to make anything better for the Ukrainian people. And I don't think NATO being involved is going to make things better for the Ukrainian people. And if people don't believe me, they could look at Libya and Afghanistan and look at its case studies of what happens when the U.S. and NATO get involved, allegedly to improve things, which is that nothing is improved and things are actually quite awful afterwards. And so, I think that conflict, we didn't have the same numbers for that, but it's been interesting because I think a lot of people's eyes have really opened in this current period about being like, oh my God, look at how horrible U.S. policy is in Palestine. And have really tried to get people to look at like, why are these aid packages being linked? Because if Congress was just asking for aid to fund the war to fund Israel's war in Palestine, I think they'd get that pass, right? But people are getting war weary. People don't want to pay for this war that's never ending in Ukraine, that the U.S. is not winning, and so people are like, let's cut our losses and leave. And so purposely, these aid packages are being joined. And I've had people be like, why are they joining these aid packages? And I'm like, the reason why these aid packages are being joined is because the US's support of, of Ukraine and sort of like NATO's conflict in Ukraine is just like, for example, the US supporting Israel's war in Palestine, and that it's promoting the US's interests in the region. And so there's a reason why these two military aid packages are going up together, which is providing for some interest because for some interesting contradictions in the ruling class, because there are people who are Democrats and people who are Republicans who are like, I would want to pay for that aid deal, but not that aid deal, and vice versa. But they're joining them together because they really need for their agenda for both of them to be passed. And they think that their odds are better if they're joined together. And then, of course, to sweeten the deal even more, what they're doing is they're throwing in, for example, immigrant attacks, because the Democrats are worried that they're not going to win the presidential election, and they have every reason to stay up at night worrying about that. But the Democrats and Republicans are like, trying to outdo each other for like who can go after immigrants more at the US-Mexico border. They're trying to throw that in to sweeten the deal. And so I think it's important for people to understand that these things are related, not just because they're in the same bill. These things are related because they're all supporting the same agenda. And that's the reason why we, as the anti-war movement, I think need to not only campaign against these bills, but to increase people's level of awareness about what are the negatives to the U.S. involvement in Ukraine, and what are the negatives about the U.S.'s strategy at the Mexico border, and sort of take the momentum that we have with a lot of people who are questioning the U.S.'s support for Israel to sort of increase people's understanding and get them to think more as consistent anti-imperialists, as opposed to just have them be like, I'm against this one war here because it makes me sad. Like, I think we have the opportunity to sort of broaden people and make people think as broader anti-imperialists. And I think that this bill provides us with some, a unique moment to sort of get people to sort of draw those connections.
Yeah, so thank you for that. I want to ask you, there's a third piece to the bill, which is aid to Taiwan. And it seems to me that's that's the most dangerous one potentially. I know back in I think 1972, Nixon went to China, and the part of the whole thing was that there was that the United States accepted that there was one China, and that Taiwan was part of China, and so the fact that the U.S. has gotten involved in elections in China, and there's been a lot of China bashing. This whole discussion about the Uyghurs in northwest China. It's back to economics. As far as I see it, it's like the Chinese now have the largest economy in the world. They've passed the United States recently, and so that's a strategic. I think the CIA calls it strategic competitor or something like that. But but to militarily, try to arm whatever the China, the Taiwan situation, and put money there seems awfully dangerous to me. Could you comment on that a little bit too? Because that's part of the same package of different things you were talking about with aid to the Ukrainian and to Israel.
Right. So when I looked up about the bill today, it shows that they're asking for 1.9 billion that could help open up access to American weapons stockpiles. And in addition to this money for Ukraine and this money for Israel, I feel like the U.S. keeps wanting to pivot to Asia in terms of really wanting to threaten China, because they're very concerned about how they're losing more and more sort of like of the control of the international economy. What's making it difficult, I think, for the United States, though, is that they're not winning anywhere. Like, they're not like things aren't going well for them in any of these conflicts. And particularly, I don't think they had any thought that this conflict with Russia was going to take over 2 years. And so I do think that they, keep sort of like, if you remember the Obama administration, he kept talking about how he wanted to make this pivot to Asia, but China's economy is doing much better than the United States. And the U.S. really wants to sort of get back and focus on that. But, the fact that the U.S. isn't doing well militarily all over the world makes that complicated for them. I am concerned about what will happen if Trump is elected, in terms of China. Like that Trump's anti-China rhetoric is even more inflamed than Biden's, and he definitely wants to sort of be the tough guy in comparison to China. And I definitely think he has an interest in accelerating that conflict more than he has an interest in, for example, continuing the conflict in Ukraine. I also am very concerned because every time the U.S. Sort of increases its anti-China rhetoric in terms of foreign policy, it leads to a huge spike in terms of hate crimes against all Asian people in the United States. And that's definitely something that we, the Anti-War Committee, did a lot of work on when Trump was president last time, was against his anti-Islamic phobic attacks. I mean, he would come to Minneapolis and particularly rail on the Somali community. We have the largest Somali community in Minneapolis outside of, I think, Mogadishu. And he would make these statements that basically he was accusing everyone who's Somali of being a terrorist. I mean, it was disgusting. It was open, flagrant racism. And so, and he talked that way about the Chinese people as well. And he, just seemed to really sort of fan the hatred of religious bigotry. And so I'm not religious and racist bigotry. And so I am concerned about not only being able to sort of be encouraging a hot war between, Taiwan and China. I'm also worried about what this means for sort of what it means for people here at home, as well as for sort of getting the U.S. involved in a potential military or economic conflict with China.
Okay. Well, yeah. Thank you for that. I want to ask you a question that's I know we're approaching International Women's Day as this is being released, and I know you're familiar with that holiday, March 8th, which every year, and it's something that's celebrated around the world, and really it's known in the United States kind of spotty, but it's a holiday that for many decades is known around the world. And I was wondering if you could comment a little bit as we approach International Women's Day in terms of the international part of it. How women around the world are fighting for liberation and some of the conflicts you mentioned, but others if you would wish to talk about that as well. But what International Women's Day means to you?
Well, this year in Minneapolis, we're going to have a International Women's Day march for women in Palestine. And I'm really excited about it because I think it gives us an opportunity to really push back on some of the rhetoric that Israel uses and sometimes the U.S. uses, where women's rights are used to justify imperialism. The United States doesn't care about rape if, for example, it happens to women who are serving in the armed forces, but they do care about rape if it allegedly happens somewhere else and it's done by the people that they, for example, want it to be done by. And so rape was used as an excuse for supporting Israel and its attacks on Palestine. I'm really excited about a lot of the Palestinian women that I work with really want to use International Women's Day as a way to respond to these allegations that of rape that have been issued against Palestinians, but also really want to talk about how rape has historically been used to be able to attack women who are organizers, as well as women who are freedom fighters in Palestine. And so I think that that's going to be important. To me, Women's Rights Day, International Women's Day is a lot like, for example, Human Rights Day or International Human Rights Day in December, which is that the U.S. really likes to weaponize this language of human rights for their own purposes without actually doing anything that improves human rights. And so if we look at, for example, what's going on in Palestine right now, disproportionately, the people who are being killed are women and children. If you look at some of, oh my God, the horrible stories of women who've been pregnant, who've been giving birth, women who've been burying their own children. I mean, there's some really gut-wrenching stories of what have happened to women in this conflict that I think that we have the opportunity to use International Women's Day to really highlight and to be to be able to sort of use this lens of gender equity and the liberation of women to be this isn't liberation, right? Bombing a civilian population, starving a civilian population, bombing refugees as they're fleeing in the area which you tell them they're supposed to flee to. This is not the liberation of women, And so I feel like we have that as an opportunity to really sort of respond to this pro-war or sort of like self-defense, rhetoric that the US and Israel use. And so I think that International Women's Day gives us that opportunity. And I'm really excited that like most of the movement here locally of Palestine, the leadership of the Palestinian community is women that I organize with, and so I'm really excited to get to see what event we're going to be able to pull off together. We're going to do it on the 9th as opposed to on the 8th, so we can do it on Saturday. And we're going to do the march through St. Paul because St. Paul is the city that so far has refused to move forward with the ceasefire resolution. And I believe that we're going to march through the president of the St. Paul City Council's ward, Mitra. We're going to march through President Mitra's ward because she's the reason why we have, even though she's Iranian and Muslim, she has refused to let us advance this ceasefire resolution. And so we want to, and the St. Paul City Council is very proud of the fact that they are an all-women city council and that they're all, but yet they haven't done anything to stand with the women of Palestine. And so we want to call out the fact that they like that, just like the US government, they like to use this rhetoric of feminism to sort of justify and pat themselves on the back. But we want to call them out on the fact that, like, if you're really so feminist, if you're really such great women leaders, then you would stand with the women of Palestine, and you haven't done anything for them. And so I do think that we're going to have some cool opportunities to really sort of use this holiday and use this event where people look at women as a way to get people to look at women in Palestine and to look at how gender is used sometimes to promote war.
Okay. So, and I want to encourage our Fight Back Radio listeners to follow Meredith's lead here. If, if you're in the Twin Cities or nearby, march on March 9th for International Women's Day. If you're in Chicago, we're going to do it on March 10th, which is the Sunday. But wherever you are, there's look for a march or a program or something for International Women's Day. This comes out of a working class movement. Initially, it was just to say to was New York garment worker women who were on strike and fighting for justice back in the early 20th century. I think it's a little over 100 years ago now. And it's something that, it has continued. The socialist leader, Clara Zetkin, introduced it into a resolution in Europe and became a international event. And so I think this is, if you can't find anything going on, hold a program, at your church or at your house or whatever. Do something for International Women's Day and uphold the role of women who are critical to the liberation of all people. So there's my commercial for International Women's Day. Unfortunately, we're running out of time here, Meredith, and it went quick. I enjoy speaking to you and hearing your wisdom. Full disclosure to our listeners, I've known Meredith for quite a while. But as we wind down, is there anything else that we haven't covered here that you would like to add, or anything that you want to say to our Fight Back Radio listeners?
So the Anti-War Committee on social media, if you wanted to follow us, is Anti-War MN. That's on TikTok, that's on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. And so if you wanted to hear more about the protests that we're organizing on March 9th, you could go there. Or, for example, if you just wanted to be able to follow us in general because you think our work is cool, you could go ahead and follow us there. I do really want to encourage your listeners to come protest at the DNC in Chicago in August.
The Democratic National Convention? Yeah. Okay, good.
And the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee, because I think that both of these choices are horrible. And I think that regardless of who's elected, I think that our work here is definitely not done. And I really believe that the real change comes in this country from the streets and from protests. And I think that politicians only give us what we make them. And so we definitely need to use these two stages as an opportunity to be able to project a better future and what we demand and what we want, because I don't think that what we're going to be offered at either of these two conventions is going to be particularly uplifting. So I think it's going to be important for us to sort of create our own vision for the future. And so I think that I'm planning on going to both. I live in the Midwest, so it'll be really easy for me to be able to get to both. And I hope that people who are your devoted listeners will also come, because I do think that it will be an opportunity for us, particularly in a way that the ballot box will never give us, or definitely is not giving us this year, an opportunity to say with a much louder voice what we want instead.
Right. Thank you for that. And our listeners, devoted or not, I hope we'll see you in Milwaukee at the Republican National Convention and in Chicago at the Democratic National Convention. They both promise to be exciting and good protests, and we must. This is a, potentially is a, we have to stand up. Otherwise, we'll never win. We'll never get anything. If you're not going forward, you're going backward. So let's go forward. So thank you, Meredith, for being our guest on Fight Back Radio. This has been a joy to talk to you.
Well, I really enjoyed it, and hello to all of your listeners.
Okay, so that was Meredith Aby, and as I told you, it's she knows her stuff, and thank you, Meredith, for being our guest on Fight Back Radio, our International Women's Day guest, especially. And I just want to repeat, people should go to International Women's Day event. They're in your area. Check it out. You can check out the Freedom Road Socialist Organization. Possibly in your area, they will have an International Women's Day event, I'm certain. And it's important, as I said, that we uphold the women in our movement and tell them the importance of what they've done, or pick up a book, about some woman activist over the years. These are all valuable things, and we need to preserve, our history and preserve this struggle. Meredith encouraged you to go to the Democratic National Convention here in Chicago and protest Joe Biden's war moves, and also the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee. We encourage you to go to both of those things, and we'll be continuing to do that right up until the time of those nominations. So we hope people can do that. But before I leave, I want to, as always, give props to the best production team ever, Dodd McColgan, Natalie Pranis, Vince Olson, and Shane Tremley. And I'm Richard Berg for the entire Fight Back Radio team, saying until next time, all power to the people. And we're out. Okay.
Excellent.
It's okay?
Yep, sure was.
Wife says it's okay. Okay, so I'm going to upload this stuff.